And then there are also things that could be done like on farm to reduce, not just reduce the carbon emissions, but increase the amount of carbon sequestration, how much carbon is being taken up through the production of coffee. And like you
Hmm.
mentioned before, right, as you're growing coffee, you're taking up carbon. Some of that carbon can also be stored and locked away for a longer time in the soil, right? But if we
Okay.
when we till the soil, right, we increase the potential for erosion.
Hmm.
Uh, we can also release some of that carbon into the atmosphere. So there are things that get into the realm of regenerative agriculture.
This episode is proudly brought to you by Mapper Forward's workshop. It's time to become a coffee consultant. Learn how to diversify your revenue streams and create freedom from your day job while saying goodbye to that alarm clock forever by becoming a consultant within the coffee industry or directly to consumers who have shifted towards home brewing and home roasting. Protect your income from challenging times in the coffee value chain by taking this course today. Go to mapperforward.coffee/workshops or click the link in the show notes for details. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and this is episode 3 of a fascinating 5-part series, our first on climate change. And I'm kind of embarrassed, John, that this is the first time we've actually had a series in over 1,000 episodes. We should have been talking about this quite some time ago. But in this episode, we're going to talk about carbon, agriculture, and climate change. What is the relationship? We touched on it in previous episodes, but what is the relationship between carbon and agriculture?
Yeah. Agriculture is actually a pretty significant source of human caused carbon emissions today. Um, and it's a little bit hard for us to think about, right? Because we know that as we are growing crops, we are actually like those crops are converting carbon dioxide, right, and water to plant biomass.
Hmm.
So it's a little bit counterintuitive. Like we're growing carbon, like we can see it, but it turns out like the whole process, when we think about the life cycle of sort of agriculture, there's a lot of fertilizer
Hmm.
applied to crops. Fertilizer has really high levels of greenhouse gases associated with it. There are energy costs embedded in agriculture. Well, a lot of the energy is sort of fossil fuel. There are, transportation, shipping costs, all these things combined. And so agriculture in general is a big portion of sort of the human contribution to climate change. That said, we need to eat, we need to drink, we want our coffee. So we're going to have to do something with that. There are ways, though, to begin to reduce the amount of carbon associated with agriculture, and that's where there are practices that can effectively begin to reduce, for example, the amount of fertilizer
Mm.
used. And there have been some estimates looking at sort of the amount of carbon dioxide associated with the production of one sort of kilogram of coffee. And like
Okay.
traditionally, like there in like there have been ways of looking at this. So if you can assume coffee is being grown in Vietnam, coffee is grown in Brazil, and that coffee is now um, you know, uh, exported to the UK, like what's sort of the total embedded carbon in going from uh farm to cup, right?
Yeah.
And some of those estimates are, I think it's like 15 kilograms of CO2 for every 1 kilogram of coffee beans.
Wow.
And it turns out that most of that is shipping, right? And
Yeah, no
it's how
surprises.
did you transport that? If you take it by air, it's much higher. If you go by ship, much lower. In the growing process, most of the carbon or the greenhouse gas contributions are
Hmm.
fertilizer, and so
Right.
that can be reduced. There's also the sort of processing and roasting costs that in
Oh,
terms of
yeah.
carbon. And so those have a certain amount of emissions associated with them, but the transport is the big one. And that one could potentially be changed. Obviously, a lot of the coffee is consumed far from where the coffee is grown. Right. That's
Yeah.
not one
Oh,
that's
yeah.
going to easily resolved. Um, And then there are also things that could be done like on farm to reduce, not just reduce the carbon emissions, but increase the amount of carbon sequestration, how much carbon is being taken up through the production of coffee. And like you
Hmm.
mentioned, or right, as you're growing coffee, you're taking up carbon. Some of that carbon can also be stored and locked away for a longer time in the soil, right? But if we
Okay.
when we till the soil, right, we increase the potential for erosion.
Hmm.
Uh, we can also release some of that carbon into the atmosphere. So there are things that get into the realm of regenerative agriculture, that actually
It's where I wanted to
can.
go next.
Yeah,
Great.
it's good. Yeah, like where we can begin to sequester more carbon. And this is one of these nature-based solutions, but in the agriculture side.
Hmm.
So there are things like that where you can, again, take more carbon and store that carbon in the biomass, living biomass, but also in soils. And in doing so, as you increase the amount of carbon in your soil and organic matter, you can also reduce the need for water application as well. Soils can hold more and more water, and that's a good sort of buffer for the water limitations that may occur in certain coffee growing areas.
When we're talking about regenerative farming, can you help define for people what regenerative farming is?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in this, but in general, this is a sort of a holistic way of farming that does not only prioritize profitability in terms of dollar amounts from the farm, but also looks at how that holistic ecosystem can interact. So it's thinking about not just the profitability of land, or sorry, of sort of crop
Hmm.
dollar per land value, but also thinking about the sustainability of that land, with the idea that that land may be in production for quite a long time. And so there are agricultural practices, and I don't know how they play out specifically for coffee, but in other agricultural systems, there are ways to basically really pump that land out for a short amount of time, get high amounts of yield, but then have that land be effectively unusable because it has high levels of salt content. And so regenerative agriculture is looking for sustainability in agricultural processes. So you're getting production from that land, but you're also making that land tenable for future uses in agriculture.
And the opposite to regenerative farming, as you mentioned, would be what we call monocropping, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So yeah, regenerative agriculture would include intercropping, agroforestry,
Mm.
these sort of more sort of natural type systems.
And we have a lot more coffee producers that are leaning towards that because of recent, it's amazing as we go through this conversation how obvious it's becoming, the complexity and the layers that so many things outside of climate actually impacts climate. Because when you look at the geopolitics of what's happened in Russia and Ukraine, 60% of the world's fertilizer comes from Ukraine and Russia. And so in Brazil, they grow the majority of, they're the biggest producer of food for the world, but they don't have the fertilizer. And so they had to send during the pandemic, and before the war happened, they sent an envoy to Russia to have a conversation with them and had to negotiate prices for it. But what we saw was some coffee producers like FAF, shout out to Felipe and his family, what they started to do, Felipe's mother from FAF, when she inherited the farm, I think she's fourth generation coffee producer. When she inherited the farm, she decided in the 70s to start transitioning it over to an organic farm. And since then has learnt an extraordinary amount about regenerative farming. And how do you find this beautiful balance between a sustainable kind of business and sustainable land? And then when they found that equilibrium, they started teaching the producers around them. And this year they held a 3-day symposium, I think, to bring producers from around Brazil in their local area to start learning how to do that. So I think it lends itself to some of the stuff you were saying in previous episodes, where there's going to be a whole bunch of little projects from around the world that are going to start to fix this climate problem. For anyone who's listening, which is the majority of people, he's nodding his head. They can't see you. A lot of them can't see you. But yes, I mean, this is where a lot of that is going. So it's just fascinating to me how we have solutions. We have solutions from an agricultural perspective that can save the climate thing. Is it economically viable for big corporations to do that? And they supply most of our food. I don't know how that's going to happen.
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, the other potential, you're trying to think about like win-wins, right? For any of these,
Right.
any solutions with climate change, because part of this is you're implementing a change to benefit the greater good, and there may be zero reward for that, right? And so if you can identify other sort of actions that you can take that can benefit the greater good, but also be a win for you individually or your company, then that becomes more approachable for groups. And it may be like that some of these sort of, again, micro solutions, regenerative farming in coffee, could have some win-wins. So like an example might be, and this happens all the time, and you have shade trees that are planted with coffee, right? In a sort of an agroforestry approach. And yes, that can increase the carbon sequestration, etc. That shade tree can also provide a little bit of a buffer for temperature extremes, right? So there are some studies that suggest that shade trees can reduce your temperatures on hot days by upwards of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. And that may buy you a little bit more time as a local adaptation so that your farm can also survive the heat, can cope with the heat, but you're also sequestering more carbon. And so I think these sort of solutions are things that are being discussed on different scales. So coffee, yes, but other scales we're thinking about where are there win-wins? Because those are going to be the first adopters to sort of these climate solutions.
It's really interesting you say that. Have you ever been to an Indian coffee farm?
No.
India has this really amazing kind of coffee ecosystem that happens. They grow a lot of Robusta in India. And to walk in a coffee farm that is majority shade-grown coffee, which is what happens a lot in India, the majority of it is like that. It's changing. Younger producers are coming in and saying, if I remove the shade, I get a higher yield. And so let's get rid of the shade. But to walk into a coffee farm that is kind of agroforested on private land, and to know that this brings in tigers and it brings in elephants and it creates this amazing ecosystem. And it's like the weather is just so wonderful inside one of these kind of coffee farms that is covered with pepper trees and covered with just amazing ecosystems. And then there's an elephant there. I mean, it's kind of cool to see that. But again, that is going away if we don't start making conscious choices and choosing longevity over profit. That seems to be a lot of what these conversations are leading to, is we can make better money with higher yield because the price of coffee is not going up. So let's just sell more. And how do we sell more? Well, we are essentially borrowing from the future, because if we remove the shade, we're decreasing the longevity of the farm.
Absolutely. Yeah. You're not only decreasing the longevity of the farm, you're also not taking in as much carbon as you could. And that's impacting everybody else, right? This climate change is a global problem. And so I mean, for a long time, I think we have been prioritizing profit over people and planet. And so trying to get that back in balance, I think, could help us.
Yeah, I hope so. In the next episode, we're we're going to focus on some of the good things. We're going to talk about the advantages, if there are any. I look forward to hearing them, John. We could really use some good news in the coffee industry right now. So join us for the next episode, folks. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, friends. Please don't forget to show us some love by subscribing, liking, commenting, and most of all, sharing this podcast with your friends. Check the show notes for links, including our sponsors and our Patreon. And stay tuned for more great conversations on the Daily Coffee Pro by Map It Forward.